The journey back to the extraction point was unlike anything Kathrani had experienced in her career. The Kreth pack moved with them through the jungle, forming a living escort that parted the undergrowth ahead and guarded the flanks behind other creatures scattered at their approach. Predators and prey alike fleeing from the combined presence of the pack and the strange beings they had accepted. Jiwan walked at the center of the formation, the juvenile staying close to his side like an oversized and extremely dangerous pet. He had cleaned most of the dirt from his wounds, and though he moved with the careful steps of someone nursing minor injuries, his overall condition was remarkably good. Kathrani walked beside him, her sensors constantly scanning the jungle, even though she knew no threat would approach them now. The Alpha Kreth led the way, its massive body carving a path through vegetation that would have taken Kathrani hours to navigate with cutting tools. "I need to understand something," she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between. Damjuan glanced at her. With that calm expression she was beginning to find less irritating and more intriguing. "You knew the Kreth were intelligent," she continued. "You knew before we even landed on this planet. And you did not say anything during the briefing. Would you have believed me?" Kathrani considered the question honestly. "No," she admitted. "I would have assumed you were romanticizing a dangerous species based on human mythology about your own predators." And now, she looked at the Alpha leading them through the jungle, at the pack members moving in coordinated formation around them, at the juvenile that had chosen to stay near the human who had saved it. "Now, I have to rewrite everything I thought I knew about Vareth Prime," she said. "And probably about humans as well." Jiwan made that soft laughing sound again. "That sounds like a lot of paperwork." "You have no idea." They walked in silence for a while longer, and Kathrani found herself studying the human with new eyes. She had dismissed him as inexperienced and fragile, a newcomer who did not understand the dangers of the galaxy. She had been so very wrong. "How many worlds have you done this on?" she asked. "Done what?" "Communicated with apex predators. Earned their trust. Become part of their social structures." Jiwan was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice carried something that sounded like weariness. "Kareth 6 was the first," he said. 3 years living among pack hunters that killed 2 previous research teams before they learned to tolerate my presence." He paused to help the juvenile navigate a fallen log, his hands gentle on its armored hide. "Then Vesh Prime, where the dominant predator was solitary and territorial, and earning its trust meant spending 6 months being stalked before it decided I was not worth the effort." "How many in total?" 7 worlds, not counting Earth." Kathrani stopped walking, and the pack flowed around her like water around a stone. 7 Category 8 or higher planets. "And your file listed you as a recent transfer with minimal field experience." "Experience is a funny thing," Jiwan said, pausing to look back at her. "The Galactic Survey measures it in cycles served and missions completed. But that does not capture what matters. And what matters? What you learned, what you survived, and who you became in the process." He resumed walking, and Kathrani hurried to catch up. The extraction point was visible now through a gap in the canopy, a clearing where their shuttle waited with its sensors, detecting the approaching life signs and probably triggering every alarm in its systems. The Kreth stopped at the tree line, unwilling or unable to approach the alien technology that waited in the clearing. Alpha made its thrumming sound one final time, and Jiwan turned to face the pack that had accepted him. He made his own sound in return, a human approximation of the Kreth farewell that somehow carried the same weight and meaning. The juvenile pressed against his legs one final time before returning to the pack, taking its place among the other young members, who would one day be the hunters and leaders of their Kinjuan. And Kathrani crossed the clearing alone, boarding the shuttle that would carry them back to Theta 7 and the civilization that awaited above as they lifted through the atmosphere. Kathrani watched the jungle shrink below them until it was just a green smear on the surface of a dangerous world. "What will you write in your report?" Jawana Skebdathrani had been thinking about that question. Since they left the clearing, her original report would have been simple and dismissive. A record of a routine survey with an inexperienced human partner who needed constant supervision. That report seemed impossible now. "The truths," she said. "Finally, I will write about intelligent apex predators and a human who speaks their language. And I will include a recommendation that will probably be ignored by everyone who reads it." "What recommendation?" "That when surveying death worlds, the Galactic Survey should request human partners." Jiwan raised his eyebrows in an expression that Kathrani now recognized as surprise. "That is a significant change from how you felt this morning." "This morning I did not understand what humans really are," Kathrani replied. "I thought your species survived through luck and technology and the fortunate timing of your development." She turned to face him directly, her compound eyes meeting his simple human ones. "I was wrong, and I intend to make sure my report reflects that." The shuttle docked with Theta 7, and word of their unusual survey had apparently spread ahead of them. Other species lined the corridors as they made their way from the docking bay, watching the human who had walked among apex predators and earned their respect. The Taurus security officer stepped forward as they passed, his massive frame blocking the corridor. "What really happened down there?" he asked, his voice rumbling with curiosity. Granny answered before Jiwan could speak. He reminded apex predators what humans are. The Taurus considered this for a moment, then stepped aside with something that looked almost like reverence. They continued through the station, and Kathrani noticed that Jiwan seemed uncomfortable with the attention. He had not sought fame or recognition for what he had done. He had simply seen a creature in need and chosen to help, regardless of the personal risk. That, she was beginning to understand, was what made humans truly dangerous, not their technology or their persistence, or even their ability to communicate with predators. It was their capacity for compassion toward species that had every reason to fear them. They reached the quarters where Jiwan was staying, and he paused at the doorway. "Thank you," he said, "for changing your mind about the report. Thank you for showing me I was wrong." He smiled, a simple human expression that Kathrani was surprised to find warming. Then he disappeared into his quarters, and she was left alone in the corridor with questions she would spend cycles trying to answer later that night. Kathrani sat in her own quarters, composing the report that would change how the Galactic Survey thought about both Varith Prime and the species called humanity. Her final recommendation would be cited for cycles to come, referenced by researchers and survey teams across dozens of worlds. "When surveying death worlds," she wrote, "request human partners if at all possible, because they speak a language that predators understand and respect. And in the end, that language may save more lives than all our technology combined." She submitted the report and turned to look out her viewport at the stars, somewhere out there, on 100 worlds she had never visited. Apex predators were hunting and killing and living by the ancient rules of the food chain, and somewhere among them, humans were walking, watching, learning to speak the language that only predators could. Kathrani had spent 40 cycles believing she understood the galaxy. Now she realized she had only just begun to learn. Time moved strangely in the clearing as Jiwan worked to free the trapped juvenile. Kathrani found herself counting heartbeats, measuring the pauses between each careful movement he made in the darkness below. The Alpha Creth had not moved from its position at the edge of the fissure. Its thrumming had quieted to a barely audible vibration that Kathrani felt more than heard, a constant pulse of anxiety that needed no translation. The main problem is a rock wedged against its third and fourth legs. Jiwan called up. His voice strained from the awkward position he had to maintain. If I can shift it toward the left wall, there should be enough space for the juvenile to pull free. What happens if you shift it the wrong way? Kithrani asked. Then the wall collapses and we find out how well my suit handles being buried under several tons of stone. He said it casually, as though discussing the weather rather than his potential. Deaf Kithrani had encountered bravery before in her career. She had worked with species that seemed to have no fear at all, and she had always assumed that was the highest form of courage. But watching Jiwan work in that unstable pit, she began to understand that true bravery was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to act, despite knowing exactly what could go wrong. The juvenile Kreth had stopped thrashing entirely. It lay still in its rocky prison, its cluster of eyes tracking every movement Jiwan made. Occasionally, it would make a soft chirping sound, and Jiwan would respond with his own quiet vocalizations. They were communicating. Kithrani realized not in words or even in the structured patterns of true language, but in something older and more basic trust. The human was telling the predator to trust him, and somehow the predator was listening. I need something to brace the upper section while I move the main stone, Jiwan said. My pack should have a telescoping support rod in the left side pocket. Kithrani moved to retrieve the item, her limbs working quickly to locate and extract the tool he needed. She extended it to its full length and lowered it into the fissure, watching as Jiwan wedged it against the unstable upper rocks. That should hold for about 30 seconds once I start moving the main piece, he said. After that, either the juvenile is free or we are both in trouble. The alpha made a sound that Kithrani could only describe as questioning. Jiwan looked up toward the edge of the fissure, meeting the massive predator's eyes directly. I understand, he said, and the certainty in his voice suggested he was not guessing at the creature's meaning. He turned back to the wedged stone and positioned himself. Carefully, Kithrani watched his muscles tense as he prepared to exert force on a rock that weighed more than he did. Human bodies were not designed for brute strength. They were too small, too soft, too fragile compared to the creatures that shared the galaxy with them. But humans had one advantage that Kithrani was only beginning to understand. They had endurance. Jiwan did not try to move the stone in one explosive effort. Instead, he applied steady, constant pressure, using his body weight and leverage to create movement where raw power would have failed. Seconds passed. Kithrani could see sweat beading on his skin, dripping down his face as his muscles strained against the immovable object. The rock shifted, just slightly, perhaps a centimeter, but Jiwan did not pause to celebrate. He adjusted his position and applied pressure again. And again, the rock moved. The juvenile sensed the change. Its legs began working against the looser stones around it, adding its own considerable strength to the effort. Between the human's patient leverage and the predator's desperate scrambling, the gap began to widen. 10 seconds on the brace, Jiwan grunted above them. The alpha had begun pacing along the edge of the fissure. Its movements were quick and agitated, and the other Kreth had picked up the same nervous energy. They could sense how close this was to disaster. Almost there, Jiwan said. Just a little more. The brace groaned as the weight above it shifted. Kithrani could see hairline cracks spreading through the rock face, the whole structure preparing to give way with a final desperate heave. The juvenile pulled its trapped legs free. It scrambled toward Jiwan, and for a terrible moment, Kithrani thought it was attacking him. Instead, it pressed against his back, using his body as a launching point to climb toward the surface. Jiwan flattened himself against the wall as the juvenile scrambled over him, claws scraping against stone as it fought toward the light. The brace snapped. Rocks began falling, filling the space where the juvenile had been trapped moments before. Jiwan was climbing his hands finding holds on the unstable surface through instinct or luck or some combination of both. The alpha leaned over the edge, and Kathrani expected it to snatch the juvenile to safety. Instead, it extended one of its massive legs toward G1, creating a stable handhold that the human grabbed without hesitation. The predator lifted him as easily as Kathrani might lift a small tool, depositing him on solid ground. Just as the fissure collapsed entirely behind him, dust and debris filled the air, obscuring everything for several long seconds. When it cleared, Kathrani saw G1 lying on his back, breathing hard, covered in dirt and small cuts, but alive. The juvenile Kreth stood over him, making those soft chirping sounds that Kathrani now recognized as gratitude. The alpha approached slowly, each step deliberate and measured. Kathrani tensed, her defensive systems ready, despite knowing they would be useless. The massive predator lowered its head until it was level with G1's chest. Then it pressed forward, touching its armored skull against the human's body in a gesture so gentle that Kathrani could barely believe what she was seeing. Her database identified the behavior immediately. Pack bonding. The alpha was accepting G1 as a member of its family, acknowledging a debt that went beyond simple gratitude. G1 raised one hand and placed it against the alpha's head, returning the gesture in his own way. They stayed like that for several seconds, while the other Kreth gathered around them, forming a protective circle that now included the human at its center. "This is impossible," Kathrani said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This should not be possible." G1 turned his head to look at her, and despite his exhaustion, she saw something like amusement in his eyes. "You keep saying that," he said. "Maybe it is time to update your definition of possible." The juvenile had recovered enough to move on its own, though it stayed close to G1, as though unwilling to let him out of its sight. The other adults took turns approaching the human, each one making the same thrumming sound of acknowledgement before returning to their positions in the pack. Kathrani watched the ritual with the eyes of a scientist, cataloging every detail for the report she would eventually have to write. But she also watched with something else, something that felt uncomfortably like humility. She had spent 40 cycles studying alien life, and she had believed she understood how the galaxy worked. Predators hunted prey species, competed for resources. Intelligence was measured by technology and language, and the ability to manipulate them. Environment. Humans had technology and language, but they had something else too. They had the ability to connect with creatures that should have been their enemies, to find common ground with species that shared nothing but the basic experience of survival. The Kreth were apex predators, feared throughout this sector of space as mindless killing machines. But they were not mindless, and they were not machines. They were a family, and they had just welcomed a human into their pack. Kathrani looked at G1, still lying on the ground with a juvenile predator curled against his side, and she realized that everything she had believed about humans was wrong. They were not weak or fragile or simple newcomers who had gotten lucky. They were something far more dangerous. They were the species that other predators chose to trust. Kathrani approached the edge of the fissure with caution, her sensors working to penetrate the darkness below. The crack in the ground was perhaps 3 meters wide and extended for at least 20 meters. Along the clearing, floor unstable rock lined the edges, and she could see where recent collapses had widened the gap. Her equipment detected a heat signature below. Something was alive down there, wedged in the rocks approximately 4 meters beneath the surface. "There is a Kreth trapped in the fissure," she said, turning to look at G1 with disbelief clear in her voice. A juvenile based on the size readings. G1 walked to the edge and looked down into the darkness. The alpha followed his movement with its cluster of eyes, that low thrumming sound continuing in its chest like a heartbeat. "How long has it been down there?" G1 Sked. Kathrani checked her readings, based on the temperature differential and metabolic markers. At least 6 hours. Too long for the pack to wait. Jiwan said quietly. They would have tried to reach it themselves. The rock is too unstable. Kethrani replied, any attempt to climb down would trigger a further collapse. And the Kreth are too large to navigate the narrow spaces safely. She paused as the full implications of the situation finally registered in her mind. They came to find us? She said slowly. They tracked us through their territory, surrounded us, and then led us here because they could not rescue their own pack member. Yes, but that would require planning and communication and the ability to recognize that we might help them. And the Kreth are supposed to be simple predators. Jiwan made a sound that Kethrani recognized as human laughter. Though there was no mockery in it, every species thinks the others are simple. He said, it is easier than admitting we might not be as special as we believe. He began removing his pack and setting it carefully on the ground near the fissure edge. Kethrani watched him with growing alarm as she realized what he intended to do. You cannot go down there, she said. The rock is unstable. And even if you reach the juvenile, there is no guarantee you can free it before the walls collapse. I know. The Kreth are dangerous creatures. And a trapped juvenile will be frightened and aggressive. I know that too. Then, why are you preparing to climb into that hole? Jiwan looked up at her. And for the first time since they had met, she saw something behind his calm exterior. It was not fear or determination or any of the emotions. She might have expected it was understanding, because they asked for help, he said, simply. Kethrani had no response to that. She stood in silence as Jiwan finished removing his unnecessary equipment and tested the stability of the rock at the edge of the fissure. The Alpha Kreth moved closer, its massive body casting a shadow across the human as he prepared to descend. I need to explain something, Jiwan said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet clearing. You asked earlier how I communicated with the Kreth, and I told you I introduced myself, but that was not the complete answer. He sat at the edge of the fissure, letting his legs dangle into the darkness while he identified handholds for his descent. Humans come from a world that wanted to kill us, he continued, not metaphorically, but literally. Every day for millions of years we fought to survive against predators that were faster and stronger and more dangerous than we were. Kethrani had heard this claim before. Every human seemed to believe their homeworld was uniquely dangerous, though the evidence suggested it was merely average by galactic standards. We did not survive because we were the best predators, Jiwan said. We survived because we learned to understand other predators. He began his descent, finding footholds in the unstable rock with careful precision. On Earth, we have creatures called wolves, he called up. They are pack hunters like the Kreth, social and intelligent and territorial. And for thousands of years, humans and wolves competed for the same prey. Kethrani moved to the edge of the fissure, watching his progress with growing fascination despite herself. Eventually, something strange happened. Jiwan continued. Some wolves began following human hunters, not to attack them, but to scavenge from their kills. And some humans began tolerating the wolves rather than driving them away. He reached a narrow ledge and paused to assess the path ahead below him. Kethrani could see the trapped juvenile shifting in its rocky prison. Over generations, the wolves learned to read human body language, and humans learned to read wolf body language. And somewhere in that process, both species realized something important. What? Kethrani asked, genuinely curious now. That being an apex predator is lonely. Jiwan resumed his descent, moving slowly toward the trapped juvenile. Every other creature either runs from you or tries to kill you, he said. Nothing wants to be near you because you are dangerous. And that isolation shapes how predators see the world. The juvenile Kreth below made a high-pitched keening sound As Jiwan approached, he began making soft, rhythmic vocalizations in response. Not words but sounds that seemed to carry calm and reassurance. When two apex predators recognize each other as equals, something changes, he continued. The wolves stopped seeing humans as competitors and started seeing us as something new, something that understood them in ways prey never could. Kathrani watched as the juvenile's thrashing slowed, the creature's multiple eyes fixed on Jiwan with an intensity that should have been terrifying. But the keening sounds had shifted into something lower and more stable. Humans carry that history with us. Jamun said, "We spent so long learning to communicate with other predators that it became part of who we are. And when we encounter new species, that ability comes through in ways we do not always control." He reached the juvenile and began examining how it was wedged between the rocks. The Kreth did not run from me, because I scared them, he said. They recognized me because something in how I move and breathe and look at the world told them I was like them. A predator, Kathrani said. An apex predator, Jiwan corrected. There is a difference. And predators know it even when they cannot explain it. He placed his hands on the rocks, pinning the juvenile in place, testing their weight and stability. This is going to take time, he called up. The rocks are interlocked in a way that requires careful removal. And if I move the wrong one first, the whole structure will collapse. The alpha Kreth made its thrumming sound again, and Kathrani could now hear the concern underlying the rhythm. What can I do? She asked, surprising herself with the question. Keep the alpha calm if you can, Jiwan replied. Talk to it, even if it does not understand the words, because the tone matters more than the meaning. Kathrani turned to face the massive predator that loomed at the edge of the fissure. Its cluster of eyes focused on her with an intensity that made her want to flee. Instead, she forced herself to speak in the calm, measured tone she used for scientific presentations. Your pack member will be retrieved, she said, feeling foolish even as the words left her mouth. The human is working to free the juvenile, and based on my observations, he appears to know what he is doing. The alpha tilted its head, and for a moment, Kathrani could almost believe it understood her below them. G1 began the slow and dangerous work of freeing a trapped predator from a collapsing pit. The other Kreth had gathered at the edge of the fissure, their massive bodies forming a ring of silent watchers. Kathrani had spent her career studying alien life, but she had never witnessed anything like this. Apex predators waiting in patient silence while a human risked his life to save one of their young. She had called the Kreth mindless and simple. She had been very wrong. Surveyor Kathrani stood before the holographic display in the briefing room of Galactic Survey Station Theta 7 and felt her mandibles click together in frustration. The orders glowing on the screen made no sense to Hera. Ground survey of Vareth Prime was dangerous enough without adding complications, and the name listed as her assigned partner was definitely a complication. Park Jiwan Humanch had worked with dozens of species across her 40-cycle career, and she had learned to respect most of them in one way or another. The Torith were reliable. In combat situations, the Melvery had unmatched technical skills. Even the timid Fenrock had their uses in delicate negotiations, but humans were different. Humans were newcomers to the galactic stage, barely 3 generations removed from their first contact with the wider universe. They were soft, fragile creatures from a world they insisted was dangerous, despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. Ikarani had read the reports about Earth, and she remained unconvinced. Yes, the planet had predators and extreme weather and geological instability, but so did many worlds. Humans acted as though surviving on their homeworld was some great achievement, when in reality, they had simply been lucky enough to develop intelligence before something ate them all. She turned away from the display and began preparing her equipment. Her 6 limbs moved with practiced efficiency as she checked each item's sonic deterrents for the smaller predators. Plasma cutter for emergency extraction, atmospheric filters rated for Category 8. Toxic environments, medical supplies designed for Velith physiology. She paused at that last item and reluctantly added a secondary kit labeled for human biology. It would probably go unused, but regulations required it. The door to the briefing room slid open, and Kathrani turned to assess her new partner. Park Ji-won was smaller than she had expected. Most humans she had encountered carried themselves with a kind of nervous energy, always moving and talking and filling silence with unnecessary sounds. This one stood quietly in the doorway, watching her with dark eyes that seemed to take in everything without giving anything back. He wore a simple survey uniform with no visible weapons. His backpack looked lighter than standard issue. His posture was relaxed in a way that Kathrani immediately interpreted as inexperience. Clearly, this human did not understand what they were walking into. "You are Park Ji-won," she said, and it was not a question. "I am," he replied, and his voice was calm and even. "I am Surveyor Kathrani, and I have led expeditions to 17 Category 8 worlds without losing a single team member." She let that statement hang in the air. Waiting for the human to show some sign of being impressed, he simply nodded. "I will be leading this mission," Kathrani continued, "and you will follow my instructions exactly as I give them." "Understood." That was all he said. No arguments. No attempts to establish his own credentials. No nervous questions about what to expect. Kathrani found his silence irritating in a way she could not quite define. She turned back to her equipment and gestured toward a secondary table where human-compatible gear had been laid out. "Your equipment is there," she said. "Check it thoroughly, because once we reach the surface, there will be no opportunity to correct mistakes." Ji-won moved to the table and began examining each item with careful attention. Kathrani watched him from the corner of her compound eyes, waiting for him to ask questions that would reveal his ignorance. Instead, he worked in silence, adjusting straps and testing seals with movements that suggested at least some basic competence. "Have you reviewed the briefing materials on Velith Prime?" Kathrani asked. "I have." "Then you know about the Kreth." Ji-won looked up at her, and something flickered across his face that she could not read. "The apex predators," he said. "Not just apex predators," Kathrani corrected, settling into a lecture she had given many times before. "The Kreth are the dominant life form on Velith Prime, and they are unlike anything you have encountered before." She activated a smaller holographic display, showing a creature that made most predators look tame by comparison. 8 legs supported a body covered in armored plates, multiple eyes clustered at the front of a head that was mostly jaw, venom glands visible along the neck, pumped toxins capable of dissolving metal. They hunt in packs of 12 to 20 individuals, Kathrani explained. They are highly territorial and extremely aggressive toward anything that enters their domain. "What do they hunt?" Ji-won asked. The question surprised her. Most newcomers asked how to avoid the Kreth or how to kill them. "Everything," she replied. "There is nothing on Velith Prime that the Kreth cannot take down if they choose to pursue it." "But what do they prefer?" Kathrani paused, uncertain why this mattered. "Large herbivores, mostly," she said. "They prefer prey that can sustain the entire pack." Ji-won nodded slowly, and again that unreadable expression crossed his face. "Anything else I should know about them?" Kathrani spent the next several minutes describing Kreth behavior patterns, territorial markers, and warning signs that indicated an imminent attack. Ji-won listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he simply thanked her for the information. She had expected fear. She had expected questions about defensive protocols and escape routes. Instead, he seemed almost thoughtful, as though she had given him interesting data to process, rather than warnings about creatures that could tear him apart. Perhaps humans were simply too ignorant to understand danger when it was explained to them. they boarded the shuttle that would take them to the surface. And Kethrani ran through final system checks while G1 secured himself in the passenger restraints. The descent through Vareth Prime's atmosphere was rough, buffeted by thermal currents rising from the endless jungle below. When they broke through the cloud layer, the world revealed itself in all its deadly beauty. Green stretched to every horizon, broken only by the silver threads of rivers, and the occasional rocky outcropping. Steam rose from the canopy, where heat vents from underground volcanic activity met the humid air. Sensors showed life signs everywhere. Thousands of creatures moving through the trees and across the forest floor in the eternal cycle of predator and prey. Shuttle touched down in a small clearing that their preliminary scans had identified as temporarily safe. Temporarily was the key word. Nothing on Vareth Prime stayed safe for long. Kethrani unsealed the hatch and stepped out into air that was thick and hot and filled with the sounds of alien life. Her compound eyes adjusted quickly to the filtered green light that made it. Through the canopy far above, she activated her defensive systems and watched as the sonic perimeter established itself around their landing zone. G1 followed her out, and she noticed immediately that he had not activated any of his defensive equipment. "Your deterrents," she said, pointing at his belt. "You need to activate them." "I will if I need to," he replied. Kethrani wanted to argue, but something in his tone suggested that pressing the issue would be pointless. Let him learn the hard way. She thought the jungle would teach him lessons that her words clearly could not. They moved away from the shuttle and into the undergrowth, following a path that sensors indicated would lead them toward their survey coordinates. The jungle pressed in around them, alive with rustling movements and strange calls that echoed through the humid air. Kethrani kept her sensors active, watching for any sign of threat. G1 walked beside her with his hand relaxed at his sides, his eyes moving constantly across the vegetation around them. He did not seem afraid. He seemed attentive in a way that Kethrani did not understand. 2 hours into their trek, her sensors registered what she had been dreading: movement in the undergrowth ahead. Large movement, multiple signatures. The Kreth had found them. Kethrani froze as her sensors painted a terrifying picture of what surrounded them. 14 distinct signatures, each one large enough to be an adult Kreth, had formed a loose circle in the undergrowth. They were being hunted, and she had led them directly into the kill zone. "We need to call for extraction," she said, her voice tight with controlled fear. Her limbs were already moving across her equipment, activating the emergency beacon that would summon the shuttle back to their position. Static filled her communicator. The dense jungle canopy and the electromagnetic interference from the volcanic vents below had cut them off. From the station above, they were alone. "The sonic deterrents," Kethrani said, reaching for G1 to activate his equipment herself if necessary. "They might hold them off long enough for us to reach higher ground." G1 held up one hand in a gesture she had learned meant wait in human body language. "Something is wrong," he said quietly before Kethrani could ask what he meant. The undergrowth ahead of them exploded with movement. Kreth burst through the vegetation, 8 legs churning the soft ground as it ran, but it was not running toward them, it was running past them, its multiple eyes fixed on something behind it that Kethrani could not see. The creature was young, perhaps half the size of a full adult, and it moved with the desperate speed of prey rather than the measured approach of a predator. More Kreth followed, crashing through the jungle in what could only be described as a stampede. Kethrani pressed herself against a tree trunk, her defensive system screaming warnings that she barely heard over the thunder of massive bodies rushing past. She expected teeth and claws and the burning agony of venom instead. The creatures ignored her entirely, flowing around her position like water. Around a stone, one passed close enough that she could have reached out and touched its armored hide. It did not even glance in her direction. The stampede lasted perhaps 2 minutes. though it felt like hours when the last of the Kreth had disappeared into the jungle ahead. Kathrani found herself standing in silence broken only by the drip of moisture from disturbed leaves. What just happened? She whispered. Edwin had not moved from his position. In the center of what had been the Kreth's path, the creatures had given him an even wider berth than they had given her, curving around him as though he stood in the center of an invisible barrier. They were running from something, he said. That is impossible, Kathrani replied, her scientific mind struggling to process what she had witnessed. The Kreth are the apex predators of this world, and nothing on Vareth Prime can threaten an entire pack. Then maybe they were not running from a predator. Kathrani did not know what to make of that statement. She checked her sensors again and found that the jungle ahead had gone quiet. The Kreth had stopped moving, perhaps 300 meters away, gathered in what appeared to be a clearing. We should go back, Kathrani said. Wait for the interference to clear and call for extraction. Our survey coordinates are ahead, Jiwan said, past where the Kreth have gathered. Then we abandon the survey, because I'm not walking into a pack of apex predators. Jiwan was quiet for a moment, and then he pointed at the trail of destruction the fleeing Kreth had left behind them. They ran right past us, he said. A pack of territorial predators encountered two unknown creatures in their hunting grounds and chose to ignore us completely. Perhaps they were too focused on whatever they were fleeing from. Maybe. Jiwan agreed, but I do not think so. He began walking toward the clearing where the Kreth had gathered. Kathrani stood frozen in place, every instinct screaming at her to flee in the opposite direction. But she was the leader of this expedition, and she could not let a human walk into danger alone while she cowered in the undergrowth. She followed, cursing under her breath in 3 different languages as they approached the clearing. Kathrani noticed something that made no sense. The Kreth were aware of their approach. She could see several of the massive creatures turning their cluster of eyes toward the movement in the vegetation, but none of them attacked. None of them even moved to intercept. They simply watched, tracking Jiwan's progress with an intensity that made Kathrani's exoskeleton itch. The clearing opened before them, and Kathrani finally got a clear look while waited there. 14 Kreth had formed a loose circle around the perimeter, their armored bodies creating a wall of chitin and muscle. In the center of the clearing stood the largest Kreth she had ever seen. This was clearly the pack alpha, a monster easily twice the size of its companions. Battle scars marked its hide, and one of its 8 eyes was a milky white from some ancient injury. It stood perfectly still, watching them enter the clearing. Jiwan stopped walking when he reached the center of the open space. The alpha was perhaps 10 meters away, close enough that it could cover the distance in a single bound. Kathrani stayed at the edge of the clearing, her defensive systems primed and ready, even though she knew they would be useless against creatures of this size. Silence stretched across the clearing like a physical weight. Then the alpha Kreth made a sound. It was a low, thrumming vibration that Kathrani felt in her chest, more than heard with her auditory organs. The sound pulsed in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, rising and falling in patterns that tugged at the edge of meaning. Jiwan stood motionless for a long moment. Then, impossibly, he made a sound in return. It was not the same as the Kreth's vocalization, but it carried a similar rhythm, a similar weight. His human throat could not produce the exact frequencies, but something in the pattern he created seemed to carry the same meaning. The alpha lowered its massive head. Kathrani watched in stunned silence as the most dangerous predator on Vareth Prime made a gesture that her database identified. Immediately, submission recognition of an equal. The alpha was not preparing to attack. It was acknowledging Jiwan as something outside the normal hierarchy of predator and prey. The other Kreth shifted in response, their postures changing in subtle ways that Kathrini's sensors struggled to interpret. The aggression that had been coiled in their muscles seemed to drain away, replaced by something that looked almost like expectation. "What did you do?" Kathrani asked. Her voice barely above a whisper. Jiwan did not answer immediately. He was watching the Alpha with an expression she could not read, his dark eyes meeting the creature's cluster of eyes in a way that seemed almost like communication. "I introduced myself," he finally said. "That is not possible." Kathrani insisted. "You cannot communicate with the Kreth, and even if you could, they are mindless predators driven by instinct." "Are they?" G1 gestured toward the pack that surrounded them. "Look at them, Surveyor, and tell me what you see." Kathrani looked. She saw predators waiting in formation. She saw coordinated positioning that suggested sophisticated pack tactics. She saw the Alpha maintaining control over its subordinates through presence alone rather than constant displays of violence. She saw intelligence. "They brought us here deliberately," G1 said. "They were not fleeing from something, and they were not ignoring us." He pointed toward the far edge of the clearing where the ground dropped away into darkness. "They were leading us to something." The Alpha made another thrumming sound, and this time Kathrani heard urgency in the pattern. Something was down there in that darkness, and the apex predators of Earth Prime had sought help from the only creatures they could not understand, from the only creatures that scared them from humans.